Hey, welcome to Keyword Crypto. This is Michael. I have a special guest, Peter Ryan. Just finished up his master's. Introduce yourself. Tell us what you were studying and why you're here.
Yeah, what's going on, guys? I guess I'm here because I'm a fan of the podcast, and
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I have some Twitter postings that Michael appreciates, and we can vibe about them right now.
Yes.
Uh, what I do, what my bio is, I just wrapped up a master's program at University College Dublin, where I focused on global history and economics. I've been totally focused within that. And prior, I was a research analyst with CoinDesk and a director of growth and journalist for CoinSpice. And so those are my crypto bona fides. More famously or infamously regarding that, I wrote an article where I basically summarized that I left crypto, I became a skeptic. I have a lot more thoughts about the merits of these technologies and, more importantly, the human and economic systems that are behind them. And so that's sort of what took me to go back to grad school to really study these things deeply and come out the other side with a new perspective.
Wait, so crypto being a scam is what propelled you into getting a master's? That's amazing.
I mean, it was not just that. There were contributing factors, but there was certainly an element where I, came into this in a lot of the same doorways that people find themselves. And as you kind of keep clawing at crypto and Bitcoin and all these theories, you keep asking the question, well, what is money? Like, where did money come from? Like, you keep getting to these very core basic questions. And ultimately, that question requires a knowledge of history. And so I felt that I couldn't really answer that for myself unless I really took the time to figure that history out. And I don't know if I fully did it, but I certainly got a foothold in the right direction.
Bruh, don't you know that Twitter is all the history you need for making financial investments?
And even that might be too much. You don't want to read too many long Twitter threads. God,
yeah, exactly. My God. So, one of the tweets. Well, so let's just get start from square one. What did you learn? Like, what was the big takeaway from getting your master's? Did it fundamentally change your outlook on economics and humanity and greed and all the good stuff that goes along with banking and rich people and how they screw us over? not to like paint you into a corner.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to fall into the meme of, guy goes to grad school, becomes over intellectualized, and, starts reading Marx at coffee shops. And, like, that's definitely not what I'm trying to do here.
But haven't you technically dropped a lot of Marx quotes on Twitter in the last year?
Ironically, in opposition to him, I think a lot of my Marx posting is actually showing how much of a sort of lightweight he really is, and from that point of view, really what actually studying history and economic development has done for me is understand that the dialectic between capitalism, communism, however you want to phrase that, these two competing systems, right wing, left wing. They're really not useful, and they're really inaccurate when you start to study these things up close. And I come from the point of view now that there's really just kind of uniform systems of how we operate, and the only differences are really how honest or dishonest are we about where power is centralized. How exactly we create feedback loops between citizens and the elites, whether they're public officials that are the rulers or they're private entities and CEOs and things like that. And so as I kind of kept seeing those things pop up more and more in the histories, you can obviously, there's like a rhyme here when you get back to crypto, because so much of crypto is about where is power located, where is centralization and where is decentralization, where are the feedback loops and where are not feedback loops.
I love that you think Marx is a lightweight. Why do you think Marx is a lightweight?
I think Marx is a lightweight because where he's interesting, he's not unique. And where he is unique, he's not interesting. And when I say that, I mean that he was brought up in the German educational system of his time. And there were colleagues of his that also came up understanding the methodologies that he would also come into practice. Uh, Famously, one of Marx's main themes is talking about the progress of history, how there's sort of a determinism to it. There's these processes we go through, and capitalism is just one inevitable but transitory stage. And ultimately, that is coming out of a broader perspective of the German university system that focuses on historical process as a fundamental analysis, where this is often contrasting with how the English university system and thinkers would sort of curate their thoughts, focusing less on history and more on uh, sort of imagined realities. And the best way to think about this is the difference between inductive and deductive logic. So, inductive is we are going to start from evidence and build our case from real world events, and then we're going to derive theories from that. Deductive is the other way around. That means we're going to kind of create a theory, an imagination, and we're going to figure out how that works rationally. And then we're going to try to apply those theories down to the real world. And so ultimately,
You just described Bitcoin.
exactly. And that's why I call Bitcoin neoliberalism, but we can follow up on that later.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So back to Marx. So then
Yeah.
what? Oh, sorry. Keep going.
But yeah, just to round off, so that's where I think a lot of the observations that he makes, that the guy wrote a lot. The guy is as influential as he is for reasons that aren't just totally everything he said was wrong. But that's where I'm saying, like, yeah, what he kind of gets right or what he pokes at that's pretty interesting is really par for the course of the generation that he was coming out of. And where he starts to sort of innovate, that's where I get lost with his material and I don't find it that instructive. And so, where I would say who is more instructive that comes out of that German school of history of economics is a guy named Frederick List, who was a peer of Marx. They didn't really cohabitate too much, but they sort of Marx wrote things about List. List never really commented on Marx because he was just a few years older, and basically, List has a much more grounded, policy-driven, action-driven economic plan that fuses these ideas of we can't have unbridled free market capitalism, or as I like to call it, English capitalism, and this idea that we can't just lose sight of the individual, we can't lose sight of the productive forces of an economy, and we have to create sort of a new system that stands in a third way between notions of English capitalism and notions of Marxian socialism, which is his system, nationalism.
Which didn't turn out so well for a lot of different countries.
Well, you say that, but I think he's writing in 1841. This is before a lot of negative connotations come with that. And ultimately, where the subdiscipline within economics, development economics, that has pretty much considered List to be the founding father of how you do development economics, of how you bring countries from less advanced stages up the value chain. And it's through a lot of his original policy recommendations that have been expanded upon that you actually find successful growth. And that's when you start to look at America's industrialization in the 19th century, Germany's, Japan's, you start going down the list, Russia's. Any country that successfully develops is echoing stuff that Frederick lists talk about. And this doesn't stop there in the 19th century. This continues on, and we can even find it with closer examples such as South Korea, Taiwan, and going down the list, like Singapore too, even as a city-state.
I mean, even technically China, but they're a little more manipulative of their own country and less open about it. But no, so I wasn't saying nationalism in the sense of like right wing authoritarian nationalism. I just mean the sense of like the types of nationalism we tried in the past of like high tariffs and America first, like focusing on ourselves. It's good for a little bit, but eventually it kind of eats itself up, doesn't it? Like eventually they have to start focusing on trading with the rest of the world.
Yeah,
But if you're saying sorry, go ahead.
No, but that is very much explicit within Frederick List's work, that these things are dynamic. They're meant to be observed and specialized. And if it becomes too corrupt, you have to take them away, or better yet, it's based on this idea of the infant industry argument. So once the industries are no longer infant, they grow up. That is when you have to take the tariffs away, take the subsidies away, and let them be regulated by the global free market.
I mean, I keep wanting to go back to crypto. Do you feel like Bitcoin is, or cryptocurrency in general, is almost at that stage now that Wall Street's getting involved and our government's starting to talk about regulations?
So is crypto needing to be protected through like sort of like a protectionist government regulation is what you're saying?
No, I feel like it was before, where the government just kind of took a hands-off approach and let it do its thing, in a way almost kind of insulating it from regulations that would normally crush an infant company. But now
Yeah,
it's at the point where there's so many different countries getting involved in it and so many big players getting involved in it. They're like, okay, it's time that we start, laying down a few laws here and there about it.
yeah,
So
that's
it's almost like
actually
the reverse, but I mean,
yeah, no, it's an innovative twist you have there, where uh, you know a way that we can create a protectionist policy is by creating a black hole in the legal system where we just don't apply certain rules because we're just letting it fly over our head for the time being. Um, yeah, I mean, in a way, you could kind of say there's some protectionism there. There's factions of the government that wanted to protect it from obvious infractions that have occurred. But I would say it wouldn't be maybe technically right to call that um, state guided protectionism, and the idea that there's sort of a plan, there's an idea of how we want to develop, and this is more again going back to that word neoliberal, sort
yeah.
of just turning the government off and letting that idea of like shareholder capitalism kind of within the shadows decide how the economy is planned, which is like again like shadowy shareholders, shadowy supercoders. There's
Yeah,
some
yeah.
common threads there.
Well, and it also goes back. It goes to the thing of like, you posted something about Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1, which I'm not a fan of, and it kind of goes to that thing of like a new industry. He mentions a new industry, kind of and I'd be interested in your take on it. But I feel like 0 to 1 is a playbook on how to create a monopoly for a new industry, and then try to take as much wealth for yourself and shut down regulation as much as possible until eventually it's going to overwhelm you, and then you just move on to the next thing. And it seems like that's kind of for the last 60, 70 years. Well, I guess I guess pretty much the history of our country has kind of been about that, is about, the Wild West. And then once it gets to a certain point, the government steps in and starts regulating it. and then a new Wild West forms, and all these monopolies come in, and then the government comes and breaks up the monopolies and sets the regulation, and then the new Wild West forms, and like first is the .com, and then savings and loans, and the mortgage crisis, and they've been taking this hands-off approach for the last, I guess, like I said, I guess forever in the history of our country. But it's been really noticeable for me in my lifetime because we've had like 4 collapses in my lifetime where the government just didn't really regulate certain things, and then evil geniuses kind of went in and figured out how to extract as much capital from average people as possible, and then the government stepped in eventually and regulated it. So it's kind of like the reverse of neoliberalism and what you were saying that list was talking about, but the goal ends up being roughly the same of letting these people kind of run rampant and break as many things as possible.
Yeah, so I believe what you're saying is like that's not in line with what would be considered like of the Frederick List School of Economics.
But is it the same outcome? Is my question.
Yeah, so I would say that um, just to put it in the sort of nominal categories of things, I would say it's not because the state is very much a part of the political economy that List is talking about.
Gotcha.
His biggest gripe, he was a huge critic um, of Adam Smith. Now, he was using Adam Smith by his day, 1841. Adam Smith's book is 1776, as sort of a catch-all term for what he called the cosmopolitans, which are people that completely orient the world into the individual versus the globe. And so there's no actual rationalization that there's um, government institutions that are in between that actually have a role in organizing society. And so that is where List is actually, again, it's like he didn't have all the tools we have today, but in a lot of spaces, he seems to be innovative in that he's trying to systematize these ideas of, well, how do we quantify or how do we bring the idea of uh, a legal code into actual like economic models? How do we bring the idea of morality of a people? Like he was trying to figure these things out, whereas Adam Smith, and that again, that's another subject. I don't think Adam Smith is as bad as most critics would suggest, but I think then the people that sort of co-opted Adam Smith and kind of used him as an avatar are certainly these types that you can really go after. And I think what List was saying was correct in that they really um, ignore and neglect the idea that the state has a role in creating laws, creating ways that protect society, that creates a good balance between letting people have freedom to innovate, to conduct productive enterprise, and having a way to say, hey, we're not just going to let you run rampant, and we're not going to let you, eviscerate people's livelihoods or just cause all this economic chaos.
Could List's viewpoints be considered colonialist or imperialist? Because from the way you were explaining it, of like we're gonna regulate this and regulate this until we don't need to anymore. Like we'll take the reins off and let you start working. But like who's making that decision? Who's saying when enough is enough, and like when it's no longer okay to be a nationalist and now you need to be a globalist? And like was it the English and the Germans kind of making that decision? Because like I mean, essentially, you said it was successful in Latin America and Asia, but we were the ones making that decision for the most part. Like we were the ones funding a lot of that. We were the ones, post World War II, we were the ones kind of being the global leader of saying, that's enough. It's time to move on. Like it's time to start trading and not price gouging and all that stuff.
Yeah, so I would say to the point that wasn't it really sort of a system of post World War II American imperialism that really created these engines of growth and the various examples I cited. I would say it is hard to totally untangle the fact of globalism and economic convergence from the success of these export-driven industries within Asian nations like South Korea, Japan, et cetera. I will say Latin America is a caveat because they never really industrialized to that extent. There's a much different history there. But to go into an example like Japan and Korea, and figuring out, well, didn't they kind of embrace globalism versus nationalism? And again, here's like a key difference is that it's not so much like you can't trade with the world, it's that you need to have productive capacity. And then this was List's entire argument. If you really had to boil it down to one thing, it was that it is not enough just to have gold, as the cosmopolitans over in England suggest you need to have, or that you have to have a comparative advantage where, hey, maybe because of your climate, your geography, whatever it is, you're just best at sort of raw exports of agriculture or minerals or something. And that's what you should just do because that's in your economic interest, because our models suggest this. And what List was saying, no, this is totally messed up because you need to have an industrialized society that is able to sort of create more growth, more value, and then that will ultimately lead to sort of export-driven industries where, yeah, of course you can trade with the rest of the world, but if you stagnate your economy like that, which is a political decision, you are going to not have the capacity to grow, and especially in certain periods through history, you're going to be beholden to more advanced powers that have military capacities that can dominate you at any time. And they have that because they developed in the way that List suggests.
I mean, it sounds like you're talking about Venezuela.
Like Venezuela would be an example of Listian economics.
Of Listian, of List warning a country. Don't focus just on exports of one good. Because if something happens to that, you're beholden to that, and you're beholden to every country around you because you can't feed yourself. And when the price of oil tanked, they couldn't even feed them. They haven't been able to feed themselves because they don't have any kind of industrial economy at this point anymore. They stopped farming. They imported everything before that happened, and without the money from inflated prices of oil, they were just at the mercy of every single country on the planet, pretty much.
Exactly. And that's why these conversations are more complicated than just, just using quick labels. Because like someone could say, well, didn't Venezuela, they were trying to nationalize things. And, they're talking a lot about that type of stuff versus sort of more of global trade. But again, like they had foreign creditors that are a big issue in sort of that whole episode going back in time. Like you said, they're sort of in a mono economy of oil. They didn't like expand and develop, and that's where when you return back to List, I mean, his entire point is you need the productive capacity, and within the productive capacity, that means every sector of your economy, pretty much. He's not going to tell, like Alaska to grow bananas. Like he's not saying that. He's saying where it is reasonable, you should have a diversified, self-sufficient economy that is able to provide for your nation alone. And then to the degree that you can export and trade with others, that is totally fine. And this is where I think a noble critic of List would come in, which is what I'm also trying to do for myself. Is that in the end of his system, in the end game, his basically happy ending is the reason why we need state protectionism is because we have this inequality of development within the world. Once nations all arrive at the same level of development, then there's none of this, starting from three spaces behind. And so ultimately, in the end game, List says we would have this beautiful, liberal, globalized free trade where the market is regulating everyone's industry. But it can only do that when everyone is equal in that sense. Now, my concern is I don't know exactly when List, would have placed this end date. I don't know if he actually really meant it. I think he may have been a lot more tongue in cheek than I think some scholars of List actually understand.
Yeah, because I mean that's like we're dealing with that in this country right now with you know overcoming the effects of 400 years of slavery and white people in this country saying, "Hey, it's slavery's over. Get over it. Like you're not being oppressed anymore." Not realizing that if it's a 100-yard meter dash, they're already at the 50. They're already like 50 meters in, and black people just got their chains taken off and are just starting to try to run. And you're like, "Hey, you don't have chains on anymore. There's nothing holding you back from winning the race." And you're like, "Bro, you're 50 yards ahead of me. Like, what are the chances?" And that's just like so. I mean, I'm hoping he was tongue in cheek, or maybe he just didn't understand anything about the caste system and what hundreds and thousands of years of oppression. I mean, I know you joke around about questioning why Ireland isn't more powerful, and my response is, 1,000 years of oppression by England, like stopping them from building their infrastructure while England was flourishing, building theirs up. When you have a country that comes in and keeps on smashing yours, there's no. It's I'm not surprised when, like, if two kids are building a Lego castle and one kid just keeps on smashing the other kid's castle, of course the kid who's doing the smashing is going to have his castle be finished first. So I hope List was tongue in cheek, but I really do. I mean, from everything you're saying, I'm having like a mini love affair with him because, America faced that also during COVID-19, during the pandemic. Is we don't produce anything anymore, and it became painfully obvious that we were trying to get all this stuff imported in, like face masks and toilet paper and all this shit that we just don't produce anymore. But when the shipping lanes shut down, we couldn't get anything. And it's embarrassing that a superpower, the most powerful country in the world, couldn't get toilet paper. Like toilet paper.
Yeah, well, that's that. I mean, that's a perfect encapsulation of what List was sort of getting at, which is like, um, you in the short term, this free trade comparative advantage stuff, it kind of works out. Some people get rich, some people get jobs, whatever. Um, but you go on a long enough time horizon, you start to see these imbalances show themselves, and so it becomes like you said. It's like, wait, we can't actually. How can we not manufacture masks? Like that just seems
Yeah.
so um, irrational. And um, not to get into too much deep stuff there, but
No, go
but to
for
go
it.
back.
That's what this show's about, is taking tangents and just running with it and see where it takes us.
No, I was just going to make a joke, but it was. But I want to get to your point of you're sort of relating uh, List to kind of this idea of the struggle and like looking at oppressed peoples and finding some sympathy and like an argument that says there's inequality, there needs to be measures to basically equalize things. And I'm not going to go off and say like List wasn't a man of the 1840s
Yeah.
and that he had a perfect opinion we would totally accept in 2021.
Yeah.
But I will say that for his time, there seems to be a level of open-mindedness, and he started from being a liberal in that classical sense of like Enlightenment values, of the idea of um, the equality of man, like in that sense of everyone can kind of come to this equality eventually. And what he was again getting at was his main book, The National System for Political Economy. It was not a coffee table book to sit in the lobby of the corporations of his day. I mean, this was a handbook for every country that did not develop up to the stage of England. Primarily, he had his own homeland, Germany, in mind, but this was a handbook meant agnostically for any country to take this up and apply these policies to develop themselves and to stand toe to toe, which was seen as, oh, the pinnacle of civilization and whatever determinism you want to apply there, which is England.
Yeah. So you and I don't know if we've disagreed. You just haven't necessarily agreed with my take that capitalism in general can't survive without slavery or borderline slavery, slave labor, immigrants, slave labor wages for immigrants. Sorry. Um, you've seemed hesitant to agree with that or to necessarily like even go down that rabbit hole. Is there a particular reason why?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, like I got into crypto earlier, so you could imagine my trajectory is coming from someone that has a disposition from the right of, sort of. I decided to study economics because I saw a Milton Friedman video back in high school.
Okay.
So, and God, does that make me cringe today? But
It's all right.
but so like
We're all on
those
our
are
own
my
journey, our own path.
yeah. So those are my priors. So I don't know if I have a reflex that says um, when someone really goes hard at capitalism, I don't know if I can fully grasp that. But going back to my meme that none of these dialectics, none of these labels actually are real. I think maybe what I'm grimacing at is this idea that like uh, productive individual enterprise, which is sort of what List is getting at the end of the day. It's not really about a system. It's about um, you know someone through hard work or their genius creating something of value, and that being sort of cherished within a human society. And to say like that thing, that nucleus, which I think we all recognize, I mean that exists,
Sure.
is totally like wrapped up in these systems of oppression. Um, I don't know. That's where I think I'm hesitant. But with that being said, I do find your point uh, just an interesting thought experiment to go down and be like, huh, that's pretty interesting as you say that, and where I can imagine like the Ben Shapiro types coming into like, actually, man, um, to rebut you is saying like, oh, well, look, England, outlawed slavery before anybody else, and like, look how progressive, like, kind of that was because it was a more efficient economic system because free labor is more economically productive on the output side of the equation than slave labor. But what no one understands is that England was getting all of their raw material
Yeah.
imports from the United States South.
It's
And
like
it's like that. I mean, that's sort of a glaring issue. And even as we move forward with America, and I think this is where I first heard you say it with this example, is like, here we have America, this beautiful shining city on a hill of capitalism. And meanwhile, all our manufacturing is coming out of communist China, which is okay, we can quibble about, is that slavery? Is that not? What degree is going on there? But we can certainly say that under your rubric of conventional mainstream left first right, China is obviously communistic, and you are deriving tons of capitalist value off the backs of a communist system. So, how does this stuff all mesh together?
well, I would say I'm talking about the buildup of a powerhouse. So I feel like we're too far along. We're already descending. We're like we're in the death spiral. The United States is in the death spiral. Can we get out of it? Hopefully. But as long as we have gerrymandered districts and a conservative party that is able to rule by decree as a minority party, then I don't see that happening anytime soon because they put profit over people. But before that, the thing that actually built us, I'm talking about like us as the superpower in like the 1950s. So up until then, even going back to the South. I mean, do you know anything about Georgia? I've mentioned this a couple of times on the podcast about how Georgia became like an economic powerhouse. They were the first state to outlaw slavery in the South, and they lasted 1 year, and their people were all starving because they didn't know how to farm in that and climate that hot.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to rewrite the state constitution and bring back slavery, and then they became this economic powerhouse. So it's like the entire South is built off of free labor. And I use free and slave in the same word because you're not, they weren't paying their slaves. So
Well,
it's
yeah,
free
when I
labor.
used free labor, I just meant the idea that it's like voluntary, and in that capitalist argument that is often made that because it's voluntary, there's more output from it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It's
So
certainly what you're saying too. Yeah.
yeah, so it's like, I mean, up until what, like the '60s, maybe we were definitely that hill, that shining house on the hill, and but it was mainly built off of we were finally getting the rewards of 400 years of slavery. We had a solid infrastructure built that allowed us to easily transition and build up an armada to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. But if we didn't have that infrastructure built by slaves, we could have the chances of us being able to do that are non-existent. I believe, just because, I mean, we can't even make masks in this country. We can't even make toilet paper anymore. It's just like it's kind of embarrassing how like, I don't know. It's kind of I feel dejected as an American sometimes when I hear conservatives especially beat their chest about how great this country is, and then at the first sign of trouble, we collapse into a corner and be like, I can't even wipe my ass. Somebody help me. It's just like, okay, tell me how great capitalism is again. Um, so
Yeah, well, I mean, that's sort of, again, like you look at this stuff like life cycles too, and yeah, like this is decline. This is a spiral downwards, and in a lot of ways too. I mean, it's orchestrated. I mean, the Reagan Thatcher revolution in the '80s, and not to mention Bill Clinton, that just continued a lot of this stuff for all the
yeah,
nominal leftism that him and you could say Blair as well in England represented. They checked all the boxes that were appropriate and basically freeing up the economy to be decided by private oligarchs.
yeah,
And their decision was, we're going to completely hollow out the industrial centers of each country, largely in America, and we're going to shift that over to China because obviously once you lower labor, but you still collect from your side up at the top office, you're increasing your profit. So that's the promise of these great ideals of the '80s and '90s, and we obviously see what has occurred today, where you have the position where we can't manufacture masks, toilet paper, whatever. We're in a industrialized graveyard, and these proposed enemies of the system, China, we basically gave them everything to accelerate what their existing economic transition that happened with Deng Xiaoping and sort of that generation after Mao, which is that they embrace basically a lot of these types of nationalist, you could say, Frederick Listian policies.
yeah.
And you combine that with the greed of Western private oligarchs who basically farm out manufacturings at the expense of the American worker.
And the foreign worker who, you know,
Oh yeah, exactly. I
jumping
mean,
out of
like,
buildings to commit suicide because the work conditions are so bad, or just catching on fire because such there's no safety protocols in place, and entire buildings burning down with everybody in it.
exactly. So there are these problems that exist, and not to throw any undue praise or gratification over at China, but the simple fact of, like, what I always looked at was like, how do you explain the statistics? Like, how do you explain the growth numbers that everybody across the ideological spectrum can agree on? Like, if capitalism is this magic thing and communism is this totally inept, decrepit, totally is not going to work, how does China do that if we're in this rubric of they're communist?
Yeah.
A similar thought I had was like, how do you explain post 1917 Russia? Like, they industrialized. Like, you can say every bad word about them, and certainly I can agree with all of that, but that doesn't get at the core principle, which I think as adults people need to wrap their heads around, which is what are the policies that are put in place that actually produce material increases in XYZ metric that allow a country to become a superpower. Humanitarian concerns aside, and how that then plays back into the feedback loop, sure has devastating effects. But like as everybody says, Russia was the real superpower that kind of won World War II. And so there's this element where you're asking, well, how did they do that if their system doesn't work? And you have to kind of keep going into these webs of complicated tangles to figure it out. And it becomes evident that there is a sort of backbone of industrial nationalist policies that ultimately stem from ideas that kind of Frederick List basically started, into how all these countries develop. And by develop, I mean, again, there's sort of systemically only one way a country kind of advances, and they have to follow this sort of backbone. And there can be humanitarian problems, oppression, everything alongside that, but it doesn't get back to this fundamental question of the statistics. If a system doesn't work, it should not be able to grow like this. Evidently, we look at Latin America to see cases like this, and obviously we see a lot of those countries do not have superpower status. And why? They don't even have minor power status. Like, why are these things there if the idea of a backbone economic system is not the internal logic that's needed to make that happen?
I mean, are you asking me rhetorically? Because
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of throwing that out there just to say that.
I mean, just blatant. I don't like blatant white supremacy and oppression. Going in and thinking that they're brown and they're incompetent, and so we're just going to force them to ship out all their stuff to our country and
Exactly. I mean,
and raise their countries and make them grow bananas.
that's the thing that now we get into this sort of discussion of imperialism.
Yeah.
So there's like, and this is where like there's the idea of nationalism, which is again the self-sufficient, constrained economic system, versus this idea of you're going beyond your borders, you're taking extrajudicial measures, you're lessening another nation's sovereignty, and you're going in purely for extractive purposes, and that exists alongside the economic development of the world, where you have these different histories when it comes to different nations' pathways, where there was nations that probably concerned themselves more with self-sufficient nationalism, and other nations that concerned themselves more with expanding through imperialism.
And it's funny that you joke around what Ben Shapiro would say, but you don't even have to point to slave owning United States of where England was getting their resources from. They still had all their colonies even when they got rid of slavery. They didn't get rid of their colonies and extracting from all these black and brown people all their resources. They just weren't actually enslaving them in the process. But I mean, technically at that point, are you really free? Are they really free when they're a colony of the white man who's taking all their resources? It's like,
well, yeah,
not
it's
really.
like tomato. I mean, you could go into colonial histories, and it's like we have all these labels of what's what, and technically is this that or this thing, but yeah, this is not okay. That maybe you don't have something that's outright slavery, but you have a system where you are imperial power through your fiat, through your nation's fiat, miles away, millions of miles away, in another land, and you are creating an apparatus of governance that is basically perpetuating your place in the hierarchy artificially. And this is where, I guess the theme of this conversation might be Frederick List, but um, not to make him out again to be someone from 2021, but I think what his core message is about is this idea of fighting that system, because England was an enemy of his in his book. He viewed England vis-a-vis Germany of his time, because like Germany wasn't really a thing at his time, really. They were statelets. They were
Yeah.
more decentralized. Prussia was the big dominant power within that sphere. And as List was looking at it, he said, England is this imperial system. They seek to kind of go in and ideologically like mess with people's brains and keep them in these lower stages of development so that they stay on top. They have consumer markets. They have markets that act as raw material exporters for extractive reasons. And even though there's no way we can compare the situation faced in sort of the small territory of Germany that was undeveloped where he grew up, to the state of a lot of the travesties that occurred in British colonies, you can find there's at least a common thread that there's a system of imperialism out there that is extractive and is not just. And there's a system of self-sufficient nationalism, which derives its justification from this idea that there is self-determination. There is sort of this way, this democratic path that people organize themselves into a body that is conducive to a given territory, to apply laws and measures that facilitate the growth of that nation. And so that's where I would say any British colony that was suffering under those conditions can find so much utility in actually understanding what Frederick List was saying, because again, the theme is anti-imperialism, nationalism. That is what he's striving at, and nationalism is something that does not have to be sort of constricted to the sort of mainstream or traditional ways we kind of think about that. I mean, a nationalism, as far as List was getting at, even though there's definitional caveats across the board. Yeah, I mean, it's that most simplistic idea is democratic ways of self-determination creates this body. And so any group of people that feels that way creates a nation as this body that can apply these things. And so, so I think he's in that way very, very relevant to any scholar, to anybody that is trying to articulate theories of anti-imperialism.
I just was like, some people's heads are exploding when you said, and Russia obviously was the powerhouse of World War II, and we wouldn't have won without them, because every single American would call you a communist at that point and say that you're a complete idiot and don't know what you're talking about and you're brainwashed, because they don't know history. And it's embarrassing how little history Americans know and how easily they're duped into believing that we're like naturally gifted as this great powerhouse and we're the best because we're American, not because our grandparents built and fought and did all this stuff. But it's so convenient how, as opposed to giving thanks to our ally on the Eastern Front, we immediately demonized them, gave all of our resources to the Western Front and rebuilt that, and then, turned them into the evil enemy. And people fell for it. And
Yeah,
it's just like,
I'm not even saying like, hey, let's revise our image of Stalin and Russia in that era to make them the good guys. Like, they were bad dudes, very bad dudes. I don't particularly like the idea that FDR and Winston Churchill were shaking hands and hobnobbing with Stalin. Like, that's pretty fucked up. But again, when you get like to this idea of we're all adults here, the idea of, hey, let's look at statistics, body count. Obviously, for people that do know, they know Russia expended the most casualties within World War World War II. Uh, much of the fighting occurred on the Eastern Front. There was a lot going on there that seemed to hold a lot more impact on the ultimate outcome of that war than things that were occurring on the Western Front. Now, you could also suggest that a lot of what the US was doing in terms of their impact, tremendous it was within the Asian theater. So it's not to take anything away or even take away from the Western Front. It's just to like get to this point of, okay, let's just matter of factly say Russia had a big influence on the outcome of World War II. And then that opens up, how do we answer that question if they didn't get there through our conventional systems of capitalism? And we don't ever answer that question. And we're left out of that dialogue, and we're left out of the dialogue with a lot of things because, like as I mentioned, Winston Churchill was shaking hands with Stalin. I don't particularly like Winston Churchill as a historical figure. I think he's kind of he ends up in this weird place at sort of just the right time to kind of be this avatar of the West in their crusade for World War II. But prior to that, I mean, he was a villain of the Irish Revolution. I mean, he wanted to really do a lot more things to the Irish, and for that matter, other colonies. He had different thoughts and opinions and ways he wanted to treat them. So I think ultimately, if we actually talk about these people from the actual letters they wrote, from the books they wrote, from the political actions they took, they become much more complicated and becomes much more of an unfortunate way to kind of look at these sort of glossed up national histories. And maybe this is through time, because we can look back at like ancient Babylonia and like don't hold any particular attachments to any one leader as like, oh, well,
Exactly.
they're our good guy. Like that's the unfortunate thing. It's all a tragedy.
Yeah.
They're all bad guys to some degree.
Well, I mean, and what's even worse is trying to paint an entire people based off of an authoritarian leader that killed, millions of his own people or hundreds of thousands of his own people. Like nobody really knows how many people Stalin killed of his own people. Not to mention the 20 million they lost in World War II. And then to sacrifice that much fighting the same enemy as the US and England and then have them turn around and demonize you. I can't imagine what that would do to the psyche of a Russian person who fought tooth and nail to keep the Nazis out of their country, shaking hands, having their leaders shake hands with the Americans and the English, fighting together. And then as soon as it's over, after taking the biggest casualties, then have them turn around and say, fuck you. We're not going to help you. We're not going to give you any resources. We're not going to give you any money. We're not going to help you rebuild your country. Nothing. You're done. Not only that, you're a fucking enemy now. Like, no wonder the Russians fucking hate us. But even then, they don't even fully really hate us. But it's just like, it's almost like that's like, I'm embarrassed about certain points in our history, and to treat an ally that sacrificed so much to help us defeat the same enemy, to treat human beings like that is just abominable. I mean, it's embarrassing that we just kind of let that go, and we were so easily manipulated into believing that Russians were bad after everything they sacrificed to help us. And granted, sacrificed to help themselves too, because the Nazis were trying to invade Russia and take it. So it wasn't like they weren't doing this all just, we're going to help America in England. It was
Well, yeah, I
definitely
mean,
helping
the
themselves.
the obvious issue that occurs immediately after the war is like for instance the West gives Poland over to Russia, and so like the ostensible reason everyone gave a shit about anything was the invasion of Poland, and the idea that they would not be an independent nation and
Yeah.
they'd be folded into the USSR. It's baffling from the standpoint of I guess where I kind of sit is I look at the world through maybe you could say like a small nation perspective. And I look at that of these superpowers, these coalitions, and saying like, you just gave us over to Russia, who we do not want to be a part of,
Yeah.
and is going to do all manner of things to us. So I mean, that's where it's like I see what you're saying. I definitely see like the West is um, schizophrenic when it comes to how it's aligning itself with the Soviet Union um, before, during, and after World War II. I mean, this is also Winston Churchill, Mister Hero, who makes the deal. He was rabidly anti-Bolshevik in the 1910s, the 1920s, like more so than any other politician. He had this fervor, and again, this is also before anyone knew anything of the atrocities that were going on over there.
Yeah.
Like he had this fervor going on that he disliked these people. So if like you look at what the guy said all the way back then, and then look how he allies himself with them in World War II, and then how he then disintegrates that, it's just so schizophrenic, and it's so, and then he gives over Poland to them. It's an amazing feat of trying to understand history from a logical perspective, and you can't always do it, unfortunately. And maybe that's because we confuse sort of the interest of a nation, of the Russian people, as you may think about, or I may think about the English people, the American people, um, with that of its leaders that sometimes don't hold that much allegiance to the actual best interests of the whole.
So to like slowly bring this back into a crypto realm,
Yeah.
which I mean, newsflash, listeners, we're not talking about crypto today. So I'll try to bring it back. Try to bring it back occasionally. Well, yeah, but a lot of this stuff is about like Bitcoiners especially love to be anti-government, not realizing that Bitcoin is a government. It has
Exactly.
it's every single cryptocurrency has a government involved, and like there's leaders, if there's not a de facto leader, there's like a board, kind of like senators and congresspeople, and it's like there's a community of people that get together and govern the body. And so it's important to understand these things. Like in my mind, the reason why Bitcoin's failing is because of bad government, not because the technology. I mean, the technology is bad, but all technology is bad in the beginning, and it slowly evolves into good technology. And it was the very first one, so you can't expect it to be perfect. But when you have bad government that won't allow it to evolve, then it's other countries, other governments, or other cryptos are going to overtake it. But oh shit, what was I saying? I was going to say something so amazing, and you all just have no idea. It's just gone forever.
But you can always edit it in later.
Yeah, exactly. So to bring it back to crypto, another thing you said that I thought was interesting was about banks, and I wanted to get your take. I wanted to like dig more into that because from the beginning they said be your own bank. That was the whole thing about cryptocurrency. It was a protest against Wall Street. It was a protest against, too much regulation about, I guess, lack of regulation. I mean, ultimately, this is the schizophrenic irony of Bitcoin is, in my mind, Bitcoin was a protest to lack of regulation in Wall Street. And if Wall Street had been more regulated, we never really would have gotten Bitcoin, because the collapse wouldn't have happened in 2008 if it was properly regulated. Mm-hmm. And people in Bitcoin claim don't want regulation, not seeing the connection to a lack of regulation causing the Wall Street collapse, which brought them Bitcoin.
Yeah. So you can. So what you covered there was sort of crypto governance, crypto as a bank, be your own bank, and regulation versus lack of regulation. I think like what's an interesting historical example to connect these things and to circle back into like these ideas of imperialism. And you mentioned earlier, like, isn't this a trend that we kind of let things be unregulated and we give them that like inverse of protection, that mirror image to let them grow. And then we come in and we say, okay, now we figured things out. We're gonna throw some laws here, and now it's a mature industry.
Yeah.
What I would say is, you look at what happened with Indian colonization vis-a-vis England. What most people don't understand
Hold on for
is
a
that
second. I think you're the first person on my podcast to ever say vis-a-vis. So I just want to let that be known.
ding, did I win a prize?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
One
there
nano.
we go. Please no. But to go to that, like most people don't know, like the English government, the state, like whatever boogeyman that libertarians often constructive of what this like eternal entity is that constantly dominates them. That state did not actually begin the process of colonization. Now we can get into this of whether like does the chartering of corporations back in that time equate to an auxiliary of the state. I'm going to go with for right now, it's not. What happened was the East India Trading Company set up shop there in, let's say the 1700s, just to throw an easy timeline out.
Yeah.
And through various ways of doing business, and certainly in the beginning, it was much more benign. It was much more, they were weak in comparison to the existing power structures of India in trying to get in there and trying to trade with them. What ends up happening over that history up until about the 1840s, 1850s, is that the East India Trading Company actually starts to find that their economic interests are better suited by getting political figures within the existing Indian power structure on their side, and then also dividing and conquering the other ones that were more collectivized. And so this is where, as the basically domino effect through the country of India happens, where the East India Company keeps taking over more and more territory and starts to take more and more of a visible hierarchical distinction within the governance of the Indian nation. It is only at this point where it becomes so visible, so aggressive, so beyond anyone's ignorance, because England is getting super wealthy at this time. There's people that are coming back and trading, and you're getting this sense of not just from the industrialization that's occurring, where you're developing capitalists as a unique class from the landowning aristocrats. A lot of those people are coming out of the colonial system from going there and deriving all this wealth here. They're called nabobs, I think is the exact term. And everyone knows the situation's happening. So there is actually like an investigation, this like huge trial to figure out what the hell is going on in India. We hear all sorts of crimes. And the conclusion of all of that is basically that the actual government of England needs to now come in and start to be a part of the company. And so there's a transitionary phase where they basically are a public-private partnership with some caveats given to governance from the private shareholders and the executive still having some running of the show, but the conflicts keep arising, and ultimately there's a big battle that happens in India, and then it's basically, okay, this is now totally like within the British imperial system. This is an official entity that the government in England has sovereignty to basically issue laws, to issue force, to decide its economic structure. And so this is how we get here. And so it becomes this idea of kind of frontier capitalism, sort of colonial capitalism, of somehow these private entities going out and actually becoming states. And that's the weird thing. They actually become states in their own right. And it's only later that the government comes in and basically abolishes them and takes over and kind of nationalizes colonialism, which was or imperialism, which was started under the guise of kind of private corporations. And so to connect that back to today's uh, case studies with crypto, I think and especially when it comes to money and banking, what a lot of people don't realize that money is also this thing that is central to the idea of how we create sort of a society. It's this like shared language. It's this shared article of faith that we all transact in. Um, and so once you start creating that system, once you start creating rules of the game of how this thing is organized, of how humans within the coding community, within the exchange community, which in the mining community all coordinate, you start to get a proto state. And this is where it's interesting is that, now we have crypto to this extent that it's worth a bunch of money. There's a lot more people. There's crypto is playing with, running countries in some extent. They're sort of in Latin America fooling around. There's other places that they've gone to basically set up miners or create little hideaways for their corporate entities. Like I think the Shellys is one.
I
And
mean,
so
talk
they're like,
about imperialism. It's like,
yeah. So I mean, you have then. I mean, and crypto. I mean, it couldn't have gotten anywhere without China as sort of this unique place that mining could exist that was able to facilitate what the Western coders were doing.
yeah,
Yeah. So again,
back to
that's
slave
another
labor.
interesting example.
Yeah. Back to, essentially harvesting energy from poor nations and, people getting paid off and to look the other way and just the complete devastation it causes to the environment. Because back then, I mean, when they first started going to China, there was zero clean energy going on. It was 100% dirty energy or hydro that just completely devastates the ecology around dams. And it goes back to strip mining African nations for diamonds, or for Latin American countries for gold, or they were just strip mining China for its electricity. And then as soon as they stood up and said you can't be anymore, they just left. Was any of that Bitcoin ever going to the Chinese? No, they weren't giving them a cut. They were paying him for the electricity in fiat, probably. I'm assuming they weren't. Maybe they were giving him some in Bitcoin, and that's the people they were getting to look the other way.
Well, the Chinese, I mean, that is a mysterious, murky underworld of who knows how that's all
Yeah,
coordinated and
yeah,
who gets paid what. But I mean, the system is these miners are short term. I mean, none of them are really hoarders of Bitcoin in the sense that we think of when we look on Twitter. These guys need to pay expenses, so they are constantly converting into whatever fiat currency they need to pay for that. They're paying electricity bills. They're paying whatever maintenance costs they have to do. It is such of a hand to mouth short term game for them that there's no consideration of like, okay, they're holding, and so they're invested parties in like the success of this thing. It's more of like they're on this like treadmill that they can't get off from whoever started it. And however that goes on with like, do those people get paid? Are there workers? Is there labor somewhere along that supply chain that gets abused? Again, it's hard to say. I think what we can look at is definitely from what you said is like there's extractive energy coming out of a system that is China. It wasn't super clean. To say what you will about hydro energy, at least there is a level of sustainability and greenness to it, and it was a state directed initiative that these libertarians were mooching off of, and so it's just very peculiar that again we see that English capitalism rose through the oppression of the American South and the rest of its colonies. We see America in the 20th century and 21st century kind of rise up in a sense on the backs of Chinese communist labor. And again, we see with Bitcoin that it rises up on the backs of the Chinese communist system.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, it's the sheer irony and the fact that, I mean, Bitcoiners just would probably never accept that narrative. They would never say that Bitcoin is successful because of communist China. I just can't imagine any of them admitting to that. And it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in the next like 5 years once all the miners are fully out of China and have set up shop somewhere else. Um, but what's your take on um, my brain is not 100% working today. What's your take on banking in general in relationship to cryptocurrency? Because from your opening statement, you said you got out of cryptocurrency, but DeFi seems to be really kind of opening the doors of what a quote unquote decentralized banking system could be. Obviously, it's not decentralized, but it's decentralized comparatively to modern day banking. What's your take on that?
Yeah. So the way, I mean, so much of what crypto is the narrative around we are an oppositional force to the traditional banking system, whether that be central banks or very much the big private banks. I mean, I don't know exactly. I don't follow it super closely as much as I did equivalently a few years ago, but um, the private banks were always just as much as an enemy as the central banks in a lot of ways. Um, and so there was always this feeling that we are doing something different. Um, there is this idea of be your own bank in the sense that, we're under the terminology of like fractional reserve banking, where you're basically using the bank as a vault and there's units that exist in there that, if it was not for the physical problems of, transportation and safekeeping, everybody could keep their units in their personal possession. And so Bitcoin arrived at that technological breakthrough to do that. But then once it gets into banking services as an intermediary, as a creditor, there wasn't that much conversation in terms of what the Bitcoin technology was really offering.
Yeah.
In that regard. Now, this is where then there's innovation. Ethereum comes to the door. You have people that are a little bit more from the traditional industry. I always thought when Joe Lubin entered, there was, in a way, I always knew that was sort of the beginning of the end. I don't know, because he comes from like J.P. Morgan, and he brought a lot of those people over, and like the whole Ethereum crowd. When I saw it start to evolve, they set up shop in Brooklyn, and there was a lot of Bitcoiners that were sort of near Manhattan back before the Bit license that kind of ejected a bunch of crypto activity out of New York. So I saw like there was like Lower Manhattan was like Bitcoin, Brooklyn was Ethereum, and even though we were in Lower Manhattan, essentially next to Wall Street, the actual Ethereum folks over in hipster Brooklyn, of course, were actually the ones that were more friendly with iBankers and things. So as you suggested, they go on eventually to create DeFi. And this is where we start to see lending services, credit, and the idea that this can all be decentralized away, and that there's no individual or collective of special interests that can dictate things. I find that hard to fully accept. I find that difficult to accept in the same way that I find like the idea that there's not a dozen or so Bitcoin developers that have monopoly control on what the actual code of Bitcoin is,
Yeah.
um, and that they can't majorly influence an outcome without like major like democratic pushback from the masses, as like the theory would suggest. Like I don't believe that exists. I don't believe that that if an outcome that went against a particular special interest within the Ethereum DeFi community happened, that there would not be mechanisms in place to basically rectify it in a way that would be conducive to those people.
What do you
I
mean?
think that
What do
you
you
have
mean exactly by that? Like, what kind of outcome do you mean?
Yeah, so I mean, like the classic example too with Ethereum is before DeFi there was the DAO,
Yeah.
and the DAO was the first big bust of crypto, where it was a decentralized autonomous organization that was pooling money and then distributing in a way that was decentralized. There was a hack; someone grabbed all the money, and there was this moment of crisis where the Ethereum core developers said, "If this thing happens, it basically kills us in the womb, and our project will never gain success because we basically let all this money go away." And to some degree,
They were
it
right.
was a lot of their money that got
Yeah.
stolen, so they were particularly interested. So among the Ethereum core developers, they come in and they rewrite the code totally artificially, totally centralized, to then create the Ethereum we all know and love today. And Ethereum Classic, which was a group of minority developers that said, we would like to maintain this decentralized property where by whim of a person, you can't just change the chain, because technically the code is law, and that hacker simply just executed the code as it was written, and that should be allowed. And so you have Ethereum, which is the bastardized version that is the most successful second chain to Bitcoin or whatever that DeFi exists on top of. And you have the runt true believers in Ethereum Classic that never got off the ground.
That's been 51% attacked multiple times.
Exactly.
But I mean, I think so. I asked that point because a lot of projects have been hacked on Ethereum in the DeFi space. And, like hundreds of millions, if not maybe over $1 billion at this point, have been stolen in these hacks. And Ethereum just keeps on moving now. So I think ultimately, and I know people probably don't like it, but I think ultimately they made the correct decision by making that one move that first time and then realizing, hey, you can't have one major DAO. You're just setting yourself up for a complete disaster, and then just allowing everybody to kind of just run rampant at that point in a million different directions. And I mean, a lot of these DeFi projects that have gotten hacked have taken money out of their own funds and repaid everybody that people that were affected by it. So obviously
Yeah,
they're
it's
making
almost
a ton of money with these projects where they can do that and not have it completely shut down their project. I mean, Rune has been hacked like 3 times in the last 3 months or something like that and lost like tens of millions of dollars. But it just keeps on ticking. Like people they're like, I mean, it went down to like $5 and now it's back up to like 18. You're like, what the fuck? What? But it just keeps on ticking. People seem to have a lot of faith in the process of Ethereum now.
yeah, it's almost like there's a benefit to centralization.
Well, I would say that it's not as decentralized anymore. That's my point. Where it's just like there's a ton of projects and they're not relying on one central DAO anymore to do that kind of stuff. There's like 1,000 DAOs, there's 1,000 DeFi projects, there's 1,000 different places, but each one definitely is centralized in the sense of they have their core team, they have the people who run it, they have the people who maintain it, the code, and maintain the user interface, and there's definitely a team, a centralized team. But I think the idea behind decentralization is, once the code is running, they don't have to do anything to keep it running. It's just running.
Yeah, and then maybe this is where decentralization and centralization don't become the most useful ways to look at this. And maybe the proper distinction is unaccountable versus accountable. Because like we all look at like, okay, there's McDonald's, that's a big corporation and chain. There's like, Joey D's pizzeria down the street, and like that's like a one-off. And we all acknowledge that there's a diversity of restaurants in the world. We're happy with that outcome. If one closes or one does something bad, we can easily go to another one. But we would never say that any of those restaurants are without hierarchy, and that when like Joey D's shits on your pizza and you say, "Hey, man, this is not what I ordered. I expect some."
I specifically said I didn't want shit on my pizza.
Yeah, I want this resolved. Joey D doesn't go back and say, "Well, man, hey, I'm decentralized. I can't be held accountable for this." And you don't go, "Oh, well, of course, yes. You are a decentralized pizzeria."
Yeah.
And so it's just so stupid when we put it in those terms. And obviously, when we look at crypto, the fact that there are many small teams does not take away from the idea that there's accountability to each team, and there's an accountability even more so to the more platform-based centralized teams like the Ethereum core developers, as everyone is building on the Ethereum blockchain. If the Ethereum blockchain goes crap or something happens within it that is beneficial to one particular team that builds on top of it, that has a lot of sway and that has a lot of power. So like that is the point of recognizing all these things, that it's not to say we cannot have diversity of competition. It's not to say that we cannot have many of these initiatives. That there's a lot of good people that are doing things on it, which, hey, I ultimately don't agree with the ultimate conclusions, but I know a lot of people are not like fully conceptualizing everything, and a lot of them are just like, hey, I'm a tinkerer and I'm just trying to do something cool.
Yeah.
So like no grudges on those folks, and they might tinker into something even better down the road that has nothing to do with Ethereum or cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the whole thing of like you saying, being a socialist or a capitalist. It's all a meme at this point, because you can call yourself anything. When people always say like, well, so and so's blah blah, and I'm like, okay, well, do you also believe DPRK is a democracy because they call themselves democratic? It's like, or they would say like, oh, so Nazis were socialists. I was like, well, not really. It's like, well, it says it in their name. And I'm like, okay, but North Koreans call themselves Democrat. Like they say they're democratic. Like it's all a meme at this point. They're just trying to portray an image to people, and you have to go back and look at what they're actually doing, not what they claim to be. You have to actually look at their actions and their history, which you're good at looking at.
Yeah, like I think that's where, if you had to, in the realm of politics, if you had to use useful labels, I think what you would describe as you have two metrics: the level of decentralization versus centralization, and the way you organize your feedback loops. And so you can look at that as democracy versus authoritarianism in the left and the right sense, as well as we have a lot of local governments that are really authoritarian, but there's like a measure of obvious, like kind of implicit democracy in that they're not so big, versus, we have this like one operating state from a federal level that is sort of going down and doing all these things. I think you could look at like the EU, for example. Probably at one point it was more of that model of, you have a lot of powerful nation states that are in this common market, and the federal state does not actually have that much power. I think as time has gone on, obviously there's been more federalization. So now you have more of a flip of the federal state actually has more power. And so that's the one metric of centralization versus decentralization. You get to feedback loops, and then it becomes, well, how much pressure can ordinary people place on their elites within the hierarchy, which is it doesn't matter if it's a public official or a private CEO. These people represent elites within the hierarchy, the power structure, and thus, how can we affect change? And if you do not have, I think, democratic ways, I think it's the voice of the people. It's probably one of the best tools we've tried to come up with to kind of mitigate that. If you don't have that, you're really, I think, suffering. You don't have a good system. And so I would say, if you were to kind of, what I would call myself, for instance, like I would look at myself as like, I think I'm like a democratic nationalist in a sense of, I believe a nation is a proper organizing unit. It can be super big, it can be super small. All that matters is that there's self-determination involved through the feedback loop of voting, democratic means, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because as you were saying that, I was just thinking like, wow, Bitcoin's like Russia. Because you got this like top-down structure. The developers are Putin and his cronies, and then you have all the oligarchs who are the miners. And at no point does, and I've said this before, I said they need to let users pick which miners mine their transactions, so they can choose miners that use green energy, like clean energy, versus ones that use dirty energy, and make the miners attest to and be audited what kind of energy use or what breakdown of energy use, like, how much CO2 they're producing and this and that. And they would never do that. They would never succumb to that. I don't ever see that happening where the users had any kind of democratic control.
But I will, as purely a meme, I'll bring us to another analogy to Russia, but older. Where, and probably a fellow traveler of ours, Mr. DeRose, first came up with it, that the Bitcoin maximalists are really like Marxist in the sense of, especially in the time period of the scaling debate, where there was all this talk of how individual nodes, listening nodes, would be able to flag their vote
Yeah.
for what update they would like. And the obvious thing that I looked at this was there's no way to accurately estimate the number of nodes in the system. There's no way to accurately know if a given node is one-to-one to a person.
Yeah.
There could be one person with 1,000 nodes.
Yeah.
Yet this theory, and this is where I like to stay in the Bitcoin theory territory because so much of it is powered by this ideology. The Bitcoin theory said, well, these nodes are basically voting, and in a way, the centralized coders or exchange guys or whatever Twitter personality that is the sort of focal point, they're kind of vocalizing that for the masses, and it becomes this dictatorship of the proletariat, if I could bastardize that. But when we get down to it, it becomes this thing, which again, I called Marx lightweight. I think there's problems with the Bolshevik Revolution and the eventual Russian system. And when you look at that, you say that there's like this meme of, hey, we have consent of the governed, we have consent of the people. This is what the masses want. We have majority rule, blah, 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 blah. But again, similarly, when you like look at it from the point of view of like an historian analyzing Bolshevik Russia, and from an historian analyzing Bitcoin maximalism in the scaling war, there was no way to actually ascertain if the nodes actually meant anything.
Yeah.
The only thing we do have that actually can be a tangible piece of evidence is the New York Agreement, which was a series of businesses within the space, which, say what you will, it's like the meme was they were the big businesses. It's like, big business, this is a minnow pond compared to what's out there. And so the only tangible evidence to show any sort of democratic process of voting was the fact that a lot of businesses ended up signing this agreement that suggested a certain fork in the update history should have been taken in terms of raising the blocks within Bitcoin that would enable more transactions. And so you take that away, and you're left with only that these nodes are the only thing that basically, as far as the narrative of the history goes, are what actually changed it back to keeping it small node. I'm a small box. But again, we don't know that. There's no way to actually tell. And you have this system where what probably more likely is the case is that a certain faction within the Bitcoin community of elites created a mechanism that allowed them to basically entrench their power in the system.
Yeah. I mean, I just see, anytime somebody on Twitter says people who run nodes have just as much power as the developers and the miners, I just imagine the developers and the miners leaning over and patting them on the head, saying, "Good boy, good boy." And it's just like,
Yeah.
because
I mean, it is peons, it's useful idiots, it's call it whatever you want it.
it's like the kid in the with the steering wheel in the passenger seat, thinking he's driving, and the mom's like, "Ooh, you're a good driver." It's like,
yeah, or even more dastardly, it's like while there were people suffering in whatever authoritarian regime, let's use Russia again. Like certainly there was people that knew what the fuck was going on,
yeah,
and there were these despicable creatures that would get up on the podium and say, "Oh, isn't this great?" And like, let me talk about how good it is, and let me travel abroad and communicate the privileges I have and how good the system is.
hell, we don't even have to talk about Russia. You can talk about that here in the South.
Oh yeah.
It's like, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, but the point stands. This is which I think that again the other theme of our conversation is just we're trying to get at the conceptual levels of a lot of these different case studies we are exploring.
Yeah,
To say what are the common threads that we can find that bring us back to crypto. We can apply them in it. And in this case, it's the incongruity between the reality of the masses and what a certain elite narrative is to basically obfuscate what the truth is.
yeah,
And that is something that is unique, I think, to a certain form of imperialism, which I think is derived from the English experience. That doesn't show up any place. You can say what you will about certain other forms of imperialism and conquest and older, more barbaric things. There is a level of honesty to it, which I don't know. I would appreciate if I'm getting screwed over, someone to tell me.
yeah.
It's why do you have to tell me that I'm not getting screwed over as you're screwing me over?
Well, I mean, it's like the modern day term is that it's just gaslighting. It's like, no, you're not. I'm not having sex with you
That's
right now. You're not bent over a barrel, taking it in the ass. It's like, no, it's just your imagination.
that's what it's. I don't know. How do we web this? It's a system of gaslight imperialism.
Yeah. I mean, well, that's all imperialism technically is. It's like that this is good for you. Me controlling you is actually, but like, we did it with slavery. And they've been doing it. They've been gaslighting poor white people in the South since slavery, saying, "Oh no, it was good for them. They enjoyed it. They were happy on the farms, on the plantations, working in 100-degree heat for no pay. They were happy, But it's just like people want. I think part of it is, it's like it's like the Nazis in World War II who went along with it, knowing something was bad. The Russians going along with it, knowing something is bad. It's got to be or like people growing up being told religion is real, and Jesus walked on water, and Muhammad did this and whatever, like whatever religion, and then becoming a grown up and learning, oh wow, everything I was told was a lie. Like, I don't think the majority of people can handle that kind of emotional reckoning, especially because at that point you kind of have to like disavow your entire youth. You have to disavow your family. You have to disavow everything, your friends, everything that you've built an identity around, or these people have built identities around. They have to then turn their back on it and start from square one. That's got to be not only emotionally taxing, but just like ripping a soul apart in essence. and I
Yeah,
can't imagine. So I try not to like be too. I mean, on Twitter, I'm a complete asshole, but in real life, I try not to be too condescending to people like that because I don't know. I was fortunate to grow up in a household that says like, "Oh, I was raised Catholic. You don't have to be anything. Start at a young age exploring everything and figure out what you believe in yourself." So I was fortunate with that. I can't imagine like growing up with a white supremacist family and being told that black people are inferior. And then I am genetically better than everybody else. And that's the reason why white people were successful for so long. Not because we were more violent, but because we were genetically superior. And then to find out, oh, wow, we're really not genetically superior. And in fact, because of 400 years of slavery, black people are actually, as a whole in this country, kind of superior in that sense of like, that's the reason why they dominate in most sports and most physical sports is because for 400 years, we were breeding them to be bigger and stronger. And so it's like, what do you do with that kind of emotional disconnect when it kind of lines up again? So I feel that a lot of people in the Bitcoin community are in that same situation. They've been led to believe a lot of this thing that Bitcoin is superior and Bitcoin is solving a problem and governments are bad and banks are bad and blah blah and Bitcoin is the future and the answer. And then you got people like Michael Saylor just being like batshit crazy delusional to try to pump their bags, saying, mortgage your house, mortgage your business, sell everything, buy more Bitcoin. It's just like, whoa, what the fuck, man? Talk about gaslighting. But people eat that up. So it scares me a little bit, honestly.
yeah, man. I think that's a super perceptive and eloquent point that you're making. That there's this psychological function that's happening, and once you have invested not just your money but your persona, your ego into this thing, how do you possibly extricate yourself from that and to not like focus on my little sob story or whatever, but I had to deal with that. Like
Yeah.
I had to deal with what I thought was this really cool solution, like going it from the perspective of, hey, a lot of people are telling me this thing can like solve a lot of problems in the world. It's technology, it's math, it's code. Like anybody can like see why that's attractive.
Oh
There's
yeah.
there's this like objective way we can logically solve problems. And then as you actually get into it, and it becomes not just a white paper, it becomes not just the code, the numbers on a screen. It becomes people. It becomes systems of organizing, of special interest, of different centers of where influence happens, of what meetings take place, of what phone calls go on. Um, and you start to see that it's a lot more familiar to the systems you thought you were getting away from
Yeah.
than it actually is. And so ultimately, I arrived at that point where I said, "Oh my God, like here, I've kind of put myself in a position where my career is tied up in this." Um, a lot of my just like personal persona, because like I posted on Twitter, I like put myself on camera, I did X, Y, or Z thing that is like tangled me in this. That if I ditch it, like it becomes like a weird disassociation.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think where I arrived at is where you could say generally everyone has to arrive at some point, is that to a certain degree you have to accept that life is a tragedy in some respect. You have to accept that um, there is not a happy ending, and through that weird singularity point, you can actually find peace, and you can actually get to a point where you do actually find the ability to kind of have a creative, positive vision for what you want to do. And so that's where I look at it from the point of view is the fact that we cannot solve the centralization problem, the human problem. does not mean that we're forever lost in this miasma of fiat state or even capitalist oligarchic control. It means that now we actually know the limits, the constraints that are placed upon us.
Yeah.
And now we can actually walk forward knowing that, not getting lost in dead ends and cul-de-sacs that will never produce the results we want. Instead, we can go right at the jugular of these systems and create actual change. And so I think that's where the benefit of actually realizing that, okay, I need to sort of accept the cost of this. And some people are not as, with the whole critical thinking meme.
Yeah.
But I think if you're supposed to be a critical thinker, there's a great book, by the way, by this guy, Marco Papik, called Geopolitical Alpha. He talks about this. He says to be an effective like investment analyst, or I'm using the term critical thinker and intellectual, whatever, you have to be a nihilist in the sense like you cannot hold yourself to any outcome. You cannot invest yourself in a personality or this or that thing. You have to accept the fact that everything can go wrong. And that is the only way that you can actually arrive at some form of an objective truth. Because if you put yourself in the position where I always have to hold fast to this outcome, that this thing can never happen, then you're never going to actually arrive at the truth. And in his case, find the best alpha for his investments. In my case, I looked from the point of view, if I'm actually after that question of what is money? Where does it come from? How do we actually solve some major economic problems? You actually do have to just accept the reality of that truth, and you have to move on. You have to move forward. And even though I can look at a lot of different directions I could have taken within crypto, and had certain other ways of interacting with especially the media system. I don't really hold like any grudges or whatever, because like I can sleep at night and I can go about my day of seeking this truth. Whereas other people, I know they know certain things, and they're being much more shallow and deceptive when they go on the different media shows. They go on Twitter and they parrot the false narratives, and they allow people to get into this swamp of distraction, these dead ends. And again, as a young guy that kind of came through that doorway and kind of got caught up in it, like I do take it personally that there are other young people that are naive, that have the best interests and intentions, and they are getting sucked up by these motherfuckers that have the worst possible motivations in some cases.
Yeah. I mean, the exact the antithesis of the Bitcoin white paper, essentially, of like, or the whole narrative of helping people. Like, I always think either Satoshi was a complete idiot who was good at math and solved the complex math problem, but didn't understand economics or human beings at all. Or he was an evil genius that understood economics and the human psyche and created a system to make himself rich. And he has the Genesis wallet with a million Bitcoin in there, and he was probably just off, mining on an anonymous account once there were enough miners where he could do it, and just extracted a ton of wealth from the network, knowing how greedy people act. It's just, yeah. Well, I'm glad you came out the other end, because a lot of people still haven't. And a lot of people have lost a lot of money. A lot of people have, lost a lot of familiar relationships because people think like Bitcoin is a cult, or people think cryptocurrency in general is just a scam, and they don't want to be critical with themselves or the thing that they're invested in. And that's the reason why things like BitConnect happen, is because, like you said, people don't want to be introspective of where they're putting their money. They just, and the whole thing of like what you said, like, I feel like it's been happening since the Industrial Revolution, where people just want to not have to take responsibility for themselves anymore and put everything off onto computers and machines. and let them do it all for them. Let them think for them. Let them be moral for them. Let them, and just sit there and extract the wealth that the machines are creating, not realizing that, that doesn't work. And hopefully, I feel like we're getting at a point where people are realizing, like, wow, all this technology isn't making things better. It's actually kind of making things worse. Maybe we need to get back down to the human connection and the humanity of it all, and realize that the machinery is just a tool, to help us get from A to B. It doesn't actually make us better or worse people. We have to actually do the work to become better people.
Yeah, man, I totally agree with you. And even going even further than that, like the ideologies and the economic models that we are employing, we outsource the human connection, the proper ways of acting to these models, whether it's on the right as like greed is good, or on the left, like, once we have the dictatorship of the proletariat, once we have sort of all the capitalists subdued, all this stuff, that will actually create a more just system,
Yeah.
or this or that, where, again, like seeing it from the point of view of like, once we acknowledge what the constraints are, we can actually say, oh, like the way we optimize the equation is the variable we can tinker with is human morality, is sort of the human connection of, it's not enough just to like create the mousetrap of a government apparatus of, are there checks and balances, and what's the Constitution say, and like how does the votes go into the machine and crunch the numbers and this and that. It's not that. It's, are you a good dude? At the like most fundamental level, are we creating good dudes and babes to actually enter the halls of government to be good leaders, and not just government, but like corporate offices.
Yeah.
And so that is such of a fundamental point, and that's where you start to arrive at, okay, well, who are the past people saying that we have to kind of return to this? Who are the current people talking about this? And fundamentally, that's where no solution from either the left or the right will actually solve these existential problems that we look at from the economy, unless they get down to this foundational level where there's a human connection and it actually matters what the moral compass of a lot of these people are.
I have this analogy of the government being a car and the Constitution being the blueprint on how to build the car and how to maintain the car, or like the manual. And the people that we elect are the ones who maintain the car and drive it in the direction we want them to go. And people are so easily manipulated into believing that government is bad, when in actuality, the government's just a car. If the car's going in the wrong direction, the car's not bad. It's the people who are driving the car in the wrong direction that we voted for. And so the same thing goes with, the Bitcoin community is, if everyone stops using Bitcoin and everyone stops buying Bitcoin because they're unhappy with the direction Bitcoin's going, I have a pretty good feeling the developers are going to switch, right? They're going to want to go where the money is. And I know we joked around about people running nodes don't have any power, but the people using it, the people buying it, are the ones that have the actual power. They're voting with their dollars. If they all buy Ethereum instead, the developers, and the price of Bitcoin starts tanking because no one's buying it anymore, and everyone's getting rid of their Bitcoin and going into somewhere else, I guarantee you the developers and the miners are going to freak the fuck out and start, having a brain trust to try to figure out what went wrong and how they can fix it.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be nice if there was a way you could, at no cost, create new money that can finance purchases within exchanges, that bring about, in terms of the price war, the price election, that can make your coin be on top.
Like some kind of coin that was like tethered to some kind of fiat standard.
Not to get into certain specifics, but I mean, this is not just like one thing,
Yeah.
but this is the thing about credit. You mentioned I had a tweet talking about the nature of how credit's created. Um, the idea that Bitcoin somehow exists as this solitary thing in a vacuum um, is just fundamentally flawed. It's starting from bad theories about economics, um, and totally divorces the idea that credit exists and that credit is fundamentally something equivalent to language.
Yeah.
You can create, I can say an infinite amount of thes. I can use that in whatever manner I want to basically create language that either instructs people to do things for me, allows me to communicate on an equal basis, or in like different levels of commands that I want to give. Ultimately, we arrive at a complex system of, uh, everything we know and love today. Equivalently, money is a very similar thing. It has been characterized as gold, as precious metals, as commodities, as this, as that, but that is only in the sense that those things act as vehicles for the actual base, which is, in a sense, fiat. It's these relationships we have where we're kind of commanding others to do something. Other scholars talk about the idea that ultimately money is like an instruction. Like whenever you give money to someone, you're basically saying a command to them. And so it's like this way that we've compartmentalized like instruction and hierarchical relationships that come along with that into this coin. And so instead of like the king needing, or the tribal chief needing to walk around commanding everybody to do something because he was on top, everyone has to listen to him. We've kind of taken that essence of the tribal chieftain and we've put it in these units of value that basically symbolize the power he represents. And ultimately, if someone gives you this coin, you need for the most part, if you're open for business, you can deny, or legal tender laws, whatever. You can deny it, but ultimately you accept it based on this idea that it's a symbolized form of instruction. And I might be coming out from like a minority viewpoint on what money is in that regard, but I think that ultimately is sort of definitionally what's going on. And so when we get back to the idea of credit again is just sort of a form of money that has a specific sort of relationship around debtors and creditors and interest payments and collateral and what happens. And so when you have crypto as a fixed asset, in a lot of cases like Bitcoin, or like variably fixed assets, or whatever, there's a sort of a basic thing going on there where you can't just print out of nowhere. And credit, which you can on an instant print out of nowhere. You can come up with forms of credit wherever you want. And the only thing preventing that thing from popping is basically the facilitation of faith and whatever the terms of the creditors want to keep going. I mean, if the creditors say, we'll renegotiate the debt deal, they can keep that going. They can supply more credit
Yeah.
to pay off whatever interest that they need to be paid. So this is where Bitcoin has nothing to say about the relationship between credit and money. Ethereum, with its experience within DeFi, has something practical to maybe offer within that, but again, does not fundamentally have anything to say critically or non-critically about theories of money and banking and credit. And so that is ultimately one of the main flaws when it comes to these crypto systems, as they don't acknowledge the realities of these true economic forces that are out there. They don't acknowledge the governance structures, the accountability. They don't acknowledge so much of the human element that you would think that, like a house of cards, eventually this thing would come down. But again, like human organizations, I don't think pure logic that we can employ here will ultimately mean that we'll be proven right in the end. I think that if a coordinated group of people want to keep something going, and their power and influence is enough to do that within the system, they can keep it going.
I got to push back on you against the Ethereum community not taking a
Sure.
stand or not taking a position on credit, because I think that up until DeFi, the language wasn't there yet. And then somebody solved it. Um, Uniswap solved it, solved a version of it, a singular way of doing it, and then Aave came along and Curve and a whole host of other ones. And it's literally only been 1 year that DeFi's been around, and there's already you know hundreds of billions of dollars locked up in DeFi now, just within 1 year. I mean, it's insane. So I think that we're in such the nascent stages of DeFi on Ethereum and on other chains as well, um, that have the ability to do smart contracts and lock up capital and lock up collateral. That as long as they keep on being, um, as long as we keep on having a humongous playing field like Ethereum has right now, with so many people building on it, I only see it getting better. And I think the downfall of Bitcoin was there was one way of doing it, and if you didn't want to do it that way, you had to fork the chain and hope that people came along with you. So it didn't allow for experimentation like Ethereum does. And every day there's a new DeFi project. So I feel like eventually we're gonna have too many and not enough money in the space to make them all work, and it's gonna shrink back down to like a solid 500 projects around the world that people are using, or 100 projects around the world. But the ability to just be as creative and experimental as they want to be and create a currency, create a token, not out of the air, but out of the work of providing collateral and and then the community deciding, does that actually have value outside of voting on which direction you'd like that DeFi project to go. I mean, I think Wi-Fi, like Wi-Fi was, or Wi-Fi, however you say it, was just so forward thinking in the idea of what is value, what is money, what and how do you earn it, that I think it kind of flipped everything on its head. Like that one project was just, or maybe it was Curve that did it first. But it's just, I mean, I think right now it's still a rich man's game, because to get loans, you have to put up twice as much collateral as you want, roughly, on average. And, but I think we're, like I said, I think we're in the nascent stage of DeFi, and I think that people on Ethereum aren't necessarily thinking about it, but they're not thinking about it. They're just letting everything happen, and they're not trying to stifle innovation. And that's what excites me about Ethereum, in the sense of like there's so many options, and no one's saying no. They're like,
Yeah.
let's get your shit audited.
Yeah.
That's all we ask. And even that, it's like, we can't stop you if you don't get it audited, but we're probably going to warn people, say, hey, there's no audit here. And
Yeah. So, I mean, that's where I said, like, I think there's something practical in what a lot of the DeFi innovations are doing. And I've kind of made the comment before, I think at a certain point, the DeFi people will distance themselves from crypto, in a sense that DeFi is already a distancing away from crypto, in the name and in what the people are trying to do.
yeah,
I think there's things you can extract from that and apply in other settings. What I am saying in terms of like the economic theory perspective is that they're just running with the theory that's out there and just trying to like improve upon it. What I'm saying is, for instance, a historical example again.
You? No. Come on.
In the 1910s, American imperialism going on Latin America, Caribbean. All sorts of shenanigans where the actual sovereignty and democratic voice of the Cuban people, in this instance, was not perfectly applied to the policies of their own nation. Over time, their nation became totally um, monocropped into sugar. Instead of diversifying, instead of making individual farmers more self-sufficient on smaller plots, it became this system of big cash crop plantation, sugar, export, get it out there. And during World War I, things were happening where sugar prices skyrocketed. And so there was a big burst. And then also, loans were already being applied in a very loose way and in a very focused way on sugar before that. And then at this moment, it became even more loose and even more aggressive. And so then the war ends and the sugar prices come crashing down. And what happens next is then the native Cubans start to say, well, this is something that's more than just we didn't make good on our end of the deal. You guys on the credit side did some improper things. There was sort of a global force de majeure that occurred. Global warring going on is not exactly like an individual fault of a given, Cuban farmer or this or that thing. So we want to negotiate terms here where you can't just come in and start dictating to us and start principally confiscating the collateral, which was the property of a lot of the farms and a lot of the sugar and a lot of the assets. And so there was a discrepancy here between who really is in control. And this becomes also the thematic point of the entire rationale for dollar diplomacy, for the Monroe Doctrine, as far as Roosevelt saw it, as far as why the U.S. had to get involved in the Western Hemisphere, is because there was a question of sovereignty when it came to foreign finance. And when a deal goes a certain way, and it's much murkier in reality than a theory would tell you, that you don't know what the facts are. And there's different opinions on that. So ultimately, as we would understand it, like in America, we have this conception that the Supreme Court is the final buck where it stops. And that is the ultimate sovereignty of the land. And when you have cases like Cuba, and one of the first real examples, I believe, was Venezuela, that was in the 1890s, that really popped all this thinking off, which was that if you have a sovereign nation that is saying basically F you to foreign creditors, what do? If that sovereign nation says, you cannot confiscate this collateral, we disagree with how you think about this deal, are they ultimately in charge? Do they ultimately get to say that final call as a referee? What the process of history taught us was that America, in particular within the Western Hemisphere and other European powers, decided that actually a lot of other countries don't have that say, that ultimately other nations get to decide the ultimate sovereignty of your country. And because you went against the foreign creditors in that way, we now have the rationale, the justification that you broke the contract of the intrinsic free market that is totally voluntary and nothing's wrong with it. And so that's where, when you look at that example, when you see that credit is much harder to determine when things go bad, and that collateral becomes much more of a issue of suspicion, because ultimately, why would you want a group of foreigners, or just collect, it could be within your own country, of a small minority of elites monopolizing ownership of all your assets? You don't want that. That's inequality. So when I look at Ethereum, when I look at DeFi, no one's talking about that. No one's really conceptualizing this idea that, well, how do we prevent bad opinions, untruthful opinions occurring about the nature of a deal going bad? What do we do about monopolization of assets through the process of loose credit for maybe the deliberate purpose of collecting on the collateral, because credit has no cost to it in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, but right now everything's collateralized through a smart contract, so they're not coming into someone's wallet and taking their funds. I mean, the funds are like pointing like the funds are like in the ether at that point. Like they're not in anybody's singular control. It's in a smart contract, locked in a smart contract. And so I mean, I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is the smart contract, if they had it back in the 1910s in Cuba, would have looked at the index of sugar prices and said, oh, they dropped, this thing, that thing, mousetrap,
Yeah.
algorithm.
Yeah.
Oh, looks like you guys can't pay your debts. Logically, I go through my code and I arrive at you reneged on the deal. Thus, the creditors get to confiscate your assets, which you're saying is already in ether and is up there. Now that's in the form of ether.
Partial assets. Yeah.
Yeah. When you start talking about other things like, now we have NFTs and we have these versions of physical property being superimposed into the blockchain. When you get to that stuff, it becomes that logic train goes automatically. And then it's like, okay, well, now this superimposed article of property on the blockchain is transferred to the creditor class. Now, as the other party in that, where you're saying, hey, wait a minute, we didn't get corrupt and misspend the money and do this. And there's other circumstances involved here where we have these things called courts to sort of iron out the kinks of how messy human relationships are. And the idea that a smart contract is going to come in and solve that better somehow, or not sort of create a system where that can maybe benefit one group over the other in terms of, like I said, if all we're doing is constructing this system that's as good as the data we're being fed into it, then what about the data providers? If they start messing around with stuff, then that's an obvious bottleneck of corruption that can occur, and that can screw over people down the stream. And so that's where it's practically, I totally agree. There's innovative things that are occurring with the technology, with how DeFi is trying to solve given problems within finance. Where I disagree is just this idea that they are not fundamentally critiquing the theory of credit, of the human element that's evolved here, and the ultimate, again, political economy, not just economy, but the political relations revolving around how humans organize from a national to an international perspective, and where sovereignty lies in deciding disputes among them within courts that are meant to be humanity-driven, messy, blurry constructs.
But even those courts can be messy constructs based on political power, political gerrymandering, political, minority rule. I understand what you're saying, and I feel like it kind of goes back to the point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect.
I feel like it goes back to the point you were making of some of the most awful people in the world are doing stuff with Bitcoin, not with these Pollyanna goals in mind. And I could absolutely see that in Ethereum as well, with all the Wall Street bros coming in and kind of recreating Wall Street on Ethereum. But what in my mind, Ethereum is, and maybe not necessarily Ethereum, because at this point it's so far along and it's so it's valued so high that it's harder to break into. But I feel like anybody with some developer knowledge can create a project and they can make it as utopian as they want. They can ask all those questions. And if enough people are also asking those questions, they say, hey, I want to put my money there instead. In my mind, it's a true free market in the sense of so like right now, like Aave has something like $300 billion on it or something like that, like something ridiculous at this point. And that's just one project. Somebody could come in to compete with Aave and literally get like $1 million of TVO. And if the code was solid and people believed in the project and it was specifically designed around safeguards like that of market manipulation, saying like, okay, so if something dips for a week and then jumps right back up, you're not going to be penalized because that was clear market manipulation. We're not going to count short squeezes. We're not going to count bull traps, that this kind of stuff. We're gonna base it off of a weekly average or something like that, like say something like that. And enough people started hearing about it and just moving their funds over. I think because of the basic nature of Ethereum over Bitcoin, that it's not it's not anyone's responsibility to think of that stuff that you're asking. It's whoever chooses to think about it and wants to actually do something about it. They have the opportunity now. And that's what I like. Whereas, like, if I want to try to compete with Wall Street, there are so many regulations involved and in place right now that it's next to impossible. Like, if I wanted to, if you and I wanted to get together and we both had $50,000 to our name, we wanted to create a hedge fund that could compete with them, it would be near impossible unless we had insider connections or rich uncles or whatever, versus Ethereum, we could start off with $1,000 of total value locked and slowly work our way up and try to get it out word of mouth. So I feel like that's my pushback. Is it's not that they're not thinking about it. It's just that they're like, dude, I don't care. If you think if that matters to you, there's nothing stopping you. Whereas in Bitcoin, there absolutely is somebody stopping them from doing that.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into, I guess, if we're going to use like in this vector, like I'm a capitalist. Like I have no problem with people organizing themselves to create innovations, to provide services for customers in X, Y, Z fashion. And they should have every right to do that. Like banks have a purpose, creditors have a purpose, and a moral, like when there's morality involved. But again, I think that like, because ultimately like my like background is just more, I guess, leaning towards Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That when I think about cryptocurrency, I do think about it as this sort of grander conversation a lot of the times, which still exists. I mean, like so much of Bitcoin in the degraded, very degraded version of it that exists, like with Saifedean Ammous in his book, The Bitcoin Standard. I disagree with that guy. I think he's a buffoon.
Oh my God. Yeah.
But what he's getting at is a grander conversation of how our economy is structured, how our monetary policy is structured, where I just don't see that level of conversation occurring in Ethereum too much. You have Vitalik and there's a guy named Glenn Wheel that kind of get at this stuff a little bit more, although there's other things that they kind of do with it. I think ultimately the best way to kind of simply like label both Bitcoin and Ethereum, it's like the Bitcoiners are more like theoreticians and the Ethereums are more tinkerers. And I think that's conducive to your point, which again, I agree with. If like they're making an innovative technology, if they're making an innovative company, like I think that's pretty cool. I think though that where they kind of may run into trouble is when they try to play into unconsciously accepting theories about, well, we're decentralized, thus we're unaccountable, thus if something goes wrong, I don't have any responsibility to rectify the situation, or I can't help be liable in any sense of a court proceeding. So that's where I have a problem with the unconsciousness which people accept in crypto of these certain theories, and they don't meditate on them. They don't think of the ramifications of what's going on.
But I
So
mean,
I
all
think we
those
largely
theories,
agree.
those are just memes, and they all come from the Bitcoin community. They also all stem from that community. Like, oh, it's self-sovereign. No, it's not. Like, I don't have control over the
We
code.
could go deeper though. We could go even deeper. We could go to Silicon Valley of the
I
'80s.
mean, exactly. And just that whole kind of like, yeah. I mean,
But you're right, man. I mean, for the context of crypto, I mean, obviously, so much of it starts within the Bitcoin
yeah,
nexus, and I think Ethereum just inherits a lot of a big. I mean, ultimately, Vitalik would have done everything on Bitcoin if he could. He left Bitcoin
yeah,
because he was sort of exiled in a sense.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I and that's where I hope that there's good people that are tinkerers, that are engineers, that are going to make something cool that they can come out of crypto and back into sort of normal mainstream society, in the sense that they accept the premise of accountability. They accept the premise of sovereignty of courts, of different jurisdictions. And so yeah, that's ultimately the problem that I see, that a lot of these people just don't fully comprehend, is like they think they're unaccountable, they think they have no liability, and they think that they can play fast and loose with international jurisdictions to avoid those things.
well, see, that's why I created this salon for us to sit there and talk about these
Ah, there
higher
you go.
theories. I mean, and that's, I mean, I joke around, but when I sat down and pitched this idea to JJ in a coffee shop 3 years ago, that's kind of what it was about, because we would sit there in the coffee shop. We were working on another project, and we would have these philosophical conversations about it because we were both critical thinkers. And I was like, I don't hear any other podcasts out there like that are pro crypto, but at the same time critically thinking about crypto. And that's why I try to get people like you on, who, you're out of the game, but it obviously still has a place in your heart, and you think about it to the point where you're having these deep thoughts about a project, about a facet of Ethereum that you weren't even into, that's only a year old, and you're already formulating really philosophical questions about the morality of it. And so people are like, "Oh, you're always bringing on no coiners." So it's like, well, I'm bringing on people who are critically thinking about these things. Um, so I appreciate that you came on and spent 2.5 hours talking about it.
Yeah, man, this flew. But I hear what you're saying, and I'm not like, I don't think like, though I wouldn't personally like ascribe the label of like Bitcoiner or crypto guy to myself anymore, even like to the degree that like I'm not in any of it anymore. I don't want to be part of any project. I have concerns about the nature of how promotion adds into this stuff, and I just don't want to be part of that supply chain that seeks to usher in new waves of naive people into a system they don't fully know about.
Yeah.
And where I will say that I'm not like a hater of people that are in it, because like I know a lot of them, and I respect them, and I know that like everybody has a different opinion. But I would say like I have no problem with somebody that wants to like create a governance structure with a focal point regarding money and banking, as in like a system of cryptocurrency, and take all of the accountability and visibility that comes with that, and the acknowledgement that we are like operating as a central bank. We are operating as one arm of a governance structure that is sort of the political state.
Yeah.
Um, and we are sort of creating that infrastructure that is representative, like a self-determined nation. So like this is where one of the things I did alongside some of the stuff that I discussed about history in my studies over this year is that I really looked at a lot of like global revolutions, like how did every single revolution occur around the world? What was the prehistory, during, post history? How do you form states after that? It's messy business.
Yeah.
And like there's a lot of problems that go into those things, and history is messy. But I think there's a fundamental morality to the idea that people have the right to um, align themselves into macro entities or to dissolve themselves out of them. And if that takes revolution, that takes revolution. If that takes a voting box, it takes a voting box to have that self determination. If they want to create then the infrastructure of money around that, which often, armed force is the first infrastructure that's created to support the future state. But in the sense that money is sort of now being created as sort of the first arm. Um, I have absolutely no problem with that. In fact, I probably think that's more um, conducive to what I want to kind of work on in the future. But and in a very much, according to the rules way. Um, but that's where I see a lot of the stuff as fellow travelers. I see a lot of the people that got into Bitcoin emotionally are about exactly what I just said.
Yeah.
But intellectually, they have not arrived there yet, and they're being led into dead ends a lot of times on purpose because they don't want people that have that emotional angst to actually go towards solutions that are meaningful, and they want them to dick around in these things like Bitcoin and cryptocurrency that serve no kind of furthering that goal, and in fact actually substantiate a new pattern of neoliberalism, which I'm calling neoliberalism, because it has many of the same hallmarks of it.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that's my final piece. Please go to ryanresearch.co and subscribe to my Substack to see any updates from me. I'm going to release my master's thesis called Irish Anti-Imperialism and Nationalist Economics, as well as some other podcasts and stuff along the way. And you can follow me on Twitter at Peter or at _Peter Ryan.
Nice. Yeah, and ask him questions. Pick his brain because he's a critical thinker. And I need to have you back on just so we can spend a whole hour or two on Ireland because
it's hilarious. We hardly touched Ireland. That's like what I've been steeped in this entire year.
I made a joke because I wasn't even sure back then if if you were from there or blah blah, and I made the joke of like most people who are super pro Ireland in the States have never even been. They have no idea what they're talking about, and so it's interesting that it's cool that you went over there because I've been over a few times to visit some family, and it's such a beautiful place, and it has a very emotionally stunted history because of oppression, because of 1,000 years of oppression. That I hear it in the jokes, like they're just like the I'm blanking on the word, self where you're kind of making fun of yourself. Self-deprecating. Like there's so much self-deprecating humor, and about like how Irish engineers are like the dumbest engineers in the world or something. Like it's just like it's so heartbreaking to hear, and I know where it comes from, and it just like it's in the blood. It just doesn't leave. So I'm hoping that maybe another couple of centuries they'll get out of that mentality. Last question. A couple months ago, you were in LA and you surfed. Was that your first time surfing?
No, but I was super rusty. So
Okay.
It was sort of like a second virginity of learning how to surf.
Did you have fun?
Yeah, I mean, I really needed it. It's like, man, you can't think about anything else besides just like you're in the water,
Yeah.
waves are coming, you get rocked,
Yeah.
you got to get back on, swim out, you're paddling, you're winded. But no, it was great. I loved it. It's like my new passion I want to do wherever I am.
Nice. Did you have a chance to surf when you were in Ireland?
No, I mean, when I was there was a lot of lockdown
Oh
measures. There
yeah,
was a
that's
lot
true.
of like you couldn't travel like outside. Like I was in Dublin County.
Okay.
You couldn't go outside, and then it was cold by the time that I was even thinking about it. So I mean, it was just like not really conducive to that. But to like comment on just quickly what you mentioned about Ireland with like its history. Like I chose to do my MA work over there for a variety of reasons. I mean, I got family connections. I've been there before. I just thought like the program was really good in terms of like the specifics of what I wanted to do. I talked to a professor there, so there was like a lot of reasons that just were a good fit. But then even as I kind of went through it and really understood things on a deeper level, you start to realize that, as I've mentioned, there's a thing about English capitalism that becomes sort of something that's very specific and something that's very original to the current modern era that we live in. And this thing is starting at English industrialization, which is the first industrialization. And you could say, like, with the advent of English colonialism, which happens earlier. But, I usually like to sort of peg it with 1776 with Adam Smith as sort of the beginning of this formulation of economics. And as you look at that, and then as you see how that then perpetuates itself in a bunch of different geographies and with a bunch of different relationships around the world, what you come back to is that Ireland is if England is the original like economic system of liberalism, of capitalism that we come to know, Ireland as a colony of England at that time, at that birth, is like this fundamental critique of it in a way.
Yeah.
That everything that it said about the free market, about how government acts, about how private actors act, all becomes critiqued by the nature that they were oppressing this neighboring island right next to
Yeah.
them. And so much of its growth was stunted. So much of terrible atrocities were committed because of it. And when we get to things like large scale famines, it wasn't just because there was a problem with the vegetable. Uh, Ireland was exporting more food out than it was importing in. If you think about that rationally, how you could make sense of that a nation could be starving to death and still be exporting more food than it's importing.
Yeah.
Um, the only way that happens is that there's a large armed force in there stealing the property from those people that are clinging to life. So that's where I ultimately come to this idea that Ireland becomes a fundamental critique, not just to capitalism, but to every other economic system like Marxism that comes within the modern era. And if we can understand that, and if we can pull lessons from that, we can actually create a new way of thinking about things on a more egalitarian basis, on a more self-sufficient basis, and in a way that I think gives the most self-determination to every single person and nation.
Nice. It's a good way to end it. It's a very uplifting way to end it.
Yeah, we got Ireland in there.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening.
Right,
and I can't wait to have you on sometime in the future and spend more time about Ireland. But because it is, I feel like we didn't do it fully justice, even as eloquent as your outgoing monologue was.
Well, thank you,
Yeah.
man. I appreciate all your questions, comments, all your thoughts as well. Very very interesting.
Nice. Well, it's important. I feel like it's important, and having people like you, even if you're not in the space, still being around the space is important. So make sure you check out his Substack, support the guy, and see you on the next one. Bye-bye.